Hi, we're Ralph and Lahni DeAmicis with another astrological minute or 10. And today we thought we would talk about the big three. You know, what is your sun, moon, and rising sign, and what has it done for you lately? I mean, these are the most personal parts of your chart, and they're frankly what people first learn about. I mean, just beyond sun sign astrology, you get to the sun, moon, rising triumvirate, and that gives you a lot of in-depth look at you and your personality and your identity.
And realize that this is part of the basic trilogy that we see throughout nature, that tendency for things to happen in threes, after all. You know, the good things happen in threes, bad things happen in threes. Well, sun, moon, rising, you know, and it's basically the sun is your spirit, the rising is your physical body, and the moon is your emotions.
So in that vein, you know, the sun can give you insights into your sense of self and character, your ego, your identity. But as you view yourself and as you, deal with the world from your personal perspective. Whereas the rising sign really can give you insights into your physical appearance or your physical location or how you relate to your physical neighborhood, your area where you are. And the moon, of course, is your emotional nature. We see the effects of the moon on the planet with the tides and things like that, and we have fluid in the body that goes on a cycle, and it's easy to relate that to your emotions.
In some ways, an easy way to think of it is that the sun traditionally relates in some ways to the father. Well, this is very traditional in society, but it was the idea that whatever kind of work your father did was the kind of work that you were going to do. If you came from a family of carpenters, good chance you were going to be a carpenter. If you came up from a family of fishermen, you were going to be a fisherman. That solar central sense
Identity,
of self.
right.
You know, how many people's last names, like Smith or Fisher or Cooper, are names that relate to that family's tradition of working in a particular area. That doesn't really necessarily tell you who the person is, but it does tell you their position in the cosmos, you might say. And I think that's an easy way to think of it. Where the moon, think of how close the word moon is to mother. And so many words that have that connection, emotions. And we learn a lot about our emotional nature and how we relate to the world emotionally from our mother and from the women in our lives, because the men are out there in the world, and the mothers are the ones who give birth to us and then take care of us and raise us up to a certain point until we're ready to start a career, and then we're handed off to the father.
Now, maybe to be a little bit more politically correct in this day and age, we should say that the sun is an indicator in a chart of the person who taught you how to be out in the world.
Right.
And the moon is an indicator of the person who taught you to love and feel loved and deal with your inner world.
So, and to be at home even, you know, where the moon oftentimes relates to how we live within our home.
And sometimes the genders of that are not exactly aligned with the old preconceived ideas of masculine and feminine. And so this is a different way to look at that. And then, of course, we get to the rising, which is kind of your personality. I mean, we do a 3-number numerological system that has a character number, a motivation number, and a personality number. And it really relates to the sun, moon, and rising in your chart, the energy, not the exact sun sign or moon sign or rising sign in your chart, but the energy of this numerological pattern relates to the same kind of emotional feeling that these planets would indicate.
It's funny because when you say the sun sign, there's one word of saying it. The moon sign, there's one way of saying it. But when you get to the rising sign, you can say the rising sign, or you can say the ascendant, or the ascending sign, or the ascending degree, because it's a mathematical point. It's basically that point on the eastern horizon in the chart, or when you read a chart, it's the line all the way to the left, which would show the eastern horizon. In some ways, relates to very early morning. It's when the sun pops up over the horizon in your personal life, or when your eyes open up and you go, oh, here I am. That's the ascendant. How do you see the world? How are you seen in the world? And it has a lot to do with physical appearance.
That's a very important point, because no matter where your sun falls within the houses of your chart, the ascendant is the ascendant and marks the first house. So,
And in terms of physicality, and it's so important because this idea of, you only make a first impression first, once. Well, it's very true. And the planets that you find by the rising, is Mars rising, is Venus rising, is Uranus rising. The planets near that rising have a lot to do with how you're seen in the world. For instance, people with the sun rising tend to, bring a lot of energy to their first experience. It's a great sign for salesmen, though maybe not quite as good as Mars rising, because sales takes a lot of bravery. So Mars rising means you bring a lot of physical energy to that first meeting, Now, maybe they're not as good at continuing things into the future, but they're great for that first handshake and for that first discussion, because so much energy is concentrated there. And it's interesting, when you look at the charts of very famous salespeople, so many of them are born right by the rising, very close to the ascending sign. Their sun is there, or they have a cluster of planets right there, because they bring a lot of energy to that initial experience.
well, your sun in the first house is kind of what you see is what you get.
Yes.
There's a lot of times, when you meet someone physically in the world, you're actually first meeting their first house, their rising sign, their personality, what they want to show to the world, the way that they see the world and the way they are seen by the world. But then when you add the sun to that component, that's their identity and their calling and their their characters. So you really get a feeling like that person very quickly when they have the sun there. And if their moon is in the first house, close to the rising sign, you get a feeling of a very emotional person, like an intuitive person, or a very person who can really understand your feelings very easily, because their moon is the first thing that you meet. And so you get to feel like you know them on an emotional level much sooner than someone who might have the moon in the 10th house or the 8th house.
Now, the sun moves a degree per day, very steady. The moon actually changes a degree about every 2.5 hours. So it goes to maybe 12 degrees in a day, or sometimes less. The moon actually varies its speed a little bit. What does this sound like? Chessboards. The sun is the king. The king moves one step up at a time. But the queen, the moon, can go all the way across the board and change here and do all kinds of things. And it has a lot to do with that difference between that solar self, we are who we are, and our emotional self, which changes direction a lot, and you never know where it's going to be, and it's going to be flexible and adjust. And it's like how people see us in the world. If a person's in a profession, that's their sun. But how, what's their family like? You come in and you walk into their office, and there's the sign on the door saying what they do. But then you come in, and there behind their desk, there's a picture of all their family and their kids and their cousins, and there's this whole complex mix of things. And this is really the big difference. It's the sun, moon, spirit, soul in many ways.
And I think we should talk just for a minute about the rising, because the rising degree changes 1 degree of the sign every 4 minutes.
Yes.
So it used to be that people would come, and they would arrange a consultation with us, and we would calculate the charts in advance. They'd take 3 hours or so to calculate by hand. Some of the more complicated charts that we use nowadays would take up to 10 hours to calculate by hand.
Computers are so cool.
And so the person would finally come, at the time they're supposed to come for a consultation. They say, oh, silly me, I found out that I wasn't born at 8 a.m. I was born at 8 p.m. Does it make a difference? We go, yeah, go away. Come back in a week. I mean, we have to recalculate all of the charts that we calculated, because every 4 minutes there's a different degree on the rising or on the ascendant. So you can imagine for 12 hours, you're totally not,
No.
Taurus rising anymore. I mean, that's, just a given. So
that's a different person.
So anything that we had prepared or had in our mind, thank goodness we have computers now, and we can calculate that in a minute. And in fact, if you don't know your sun, moon, rising, there are many chart services that can calculate that for you, and at least you can figure out the symbols, the glyphs for the sun, moon, and rising, and you can figure out those three dynamics of your chart, even if you don't have the opportunity to delve into your chart a little bit more deeply.
Yeah, and in fact, you actually know that when, like for instance, in the planetary calendar, that when the moon is going through the sign of either your moon or your rising, it will tend to be a more emotional day for you, in a good way, hopefully in a good way. And that's, if you know that, you kind of couch your life in that way. Make sure you're going to be around people who you like.
And I'm glad you brought up using the calendar, because when you're using the calendar, of course, above the number are the glyphs, the symbols that denote the planets.
Yep.
And it's one thing to use those glyphs to find the ruler of your sun sign, but you can also use them for the ruler of your rising or your moon to determine what days or actions might be appropriate for you.
In some ways, the planets that are above the number are basically which kids are getting along with mom that day.
Because it's how they relate to the moon, where the sign, where the moon is.
And because the moon changes sign, moves so fast, that changes, just like in a family, who's your favorite kid today? I love all my kids the same, but today...
Well, and it changes signs completely in every 2.5 days.
Exactly.
So that's a fast-moving, energetic flow.
Now, there's one other point. Most people know that, the sun, moon, rising, they know about that. But there's actually another point which is very important, which is in the ancient times, and all the way through medieval astrology as well, was considered very important, was the midheaven. And the midheaven is basically another mathematical point like the ascendant, but it's directly over your head. And the way I like to describe it is like the flag above your castle, because it says, what is my career path going to be? You could be born to be a fisherman, but maybe your father had one boat and you have Saturn at the midheaven in Leo and you want to have 20 boats, because it's at the midheaven. It has to do with how are you going to fulfill your responsibilities in the world, how are you going to climb the cliffs of career. And traditionally, this was always considered one of the 4 most important points, along with the sun, moon, rising. And in some ways, I think, depending upon the person, it can be more important if a person's really, their life is really focused on career or on duty.
Well, and it doesn't mean that whatever the rising sign is going to determine what your midheaven or your career in the end is going to be. It's interesting sometimes to look at and see how one is what you were born into, kind of out of no choice of your own, except for that, cosmic choice that you make to incarnate at that time. And the other one is more what you develop your skills in. And so they can be very different. So it can give us a lot of interesting insights into kind of what your parents might want you to be and what you want to do in the world for your personal satisfaction and success.
And life has duality in it. That's just part of the game. So
exactly. So come visit us again, and you can always see us at spaceandtime.com, and that's another Astrological Minute. We made it in just a minute, didn't we?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.